Welcome to the course on medical law. This lecture will be about law regulating clinical trials in India. The concepts covered in this lecture are clinical trial regulations, legal framework in India, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, international regulatory landscape, legal and ethical considerations. The keywords of this lecture can be seen here. Clinical trials form an integral part of drug discovery process across the world. Clinical trials are set of practices required to certify a new drug molecule as safe and efficacious for the market. Medical research in general is absolutely necessary to cure a number of chronic diseases. Clinical trials have long been controversial even after decades of debate, experience and regulations. Clinical trial is defined as any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or group of humans to one or more health related interventions to evaluate the effect on health outcomes. The interventions include not only drugs but also cells and other biological products, surgical procedures, radiological procedures, devices, behavioral treatment, process of care changes, preventive care, etc. A set of guidelines is already in place in India for the ethical conduct of studies to safeguard the interest of patients or volunteers who are participating in the clinical trial. So, clinical trial generally means the trial conducted on human subjects of a new drug or a medical device. So, in order to conduct a clinical trial, the company has to follow appropriate regulatory requirement prescribed in the national legislation. Let us start with international regulations on clinical trial. It is the Nazi medical experiments which made the global community realize the need for ethical guidelines in human research. After World War II, ethical considerations in medical research gained prominence. In 1947, the Nuremberg Code was established, which emphasized the importance of free and informed consent. It mandated that voluntary consent of human subjects is essential as part of ethical research practice. As a result, stringent ethical standards were made mandatory to perform clinical trial with human subjects. The Nuremberg Code laid the foundation for ethical principle of informed consent, ensuring that the participants has full understanding and they willingly agree to participate in the clinical trial. The Nuremberg Code catalyzed the development of subsequent international conventions and guidelines which are aimed at the rights and well-being of research participants. The World Medical Association's Helsinki Declaration in 1964 modified the principles of Nuremberg Code. These changes allowed for the use of surrogate consent in cases where the subject is impaired with decision making capacity. Now, let us look at the regulatory framework in India. In India, it is the Central Drug Standard Controls Organization which is coming under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which regulates clinical trials in India. It is the main body that works on the development of regulatory procedures and standards for drugs, cosmetics, diagnostics and devices for medical treatment. The CDSCO lays down the regulatory guidance through implementation of Act, rules and regulates the new drug approval process in the country. Its main objective is to standardize clinical research and bring out safer drugs to the Indian market. The Drug Controller General of India is responsible for giving regulatory permissions for the conduct of clinical trials and also approve marketing licenses for drugs in India. Along with the Drug Controller General's office, there are other governmental bodies which are involved in pharmaceutical regulations of new drugs. So, if a company wants to take approval for a new drug, they have to make an application to the Drug Controller General of India. The office of the Drug Controller reviews the application and grants the approval after necessary investigations. The required time for approval depends upon the regulatory status of the trial in different countries. The regulations of the CDSCO are updated to harmonize the international standards, especially the US FDA like regulatory bodies. It is expected that in the coming years, many changes will be made to the current regulatory process of drug trial approval. The CDSCO has plans to establish single window clearance for approvals and fixed timeline for each approval as 2 to 6 weeks, and the new drug application status will be updated on the internet. Subject experts, reviewers, internal and external, will also be employed. There is also a plan to increase the staff and infrastructure at on-site and give continuous training to its officers. Now, let us have a look at the main components of the regulatory framework for drug trials in India. In India, the main legislation which deals with drug approval is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. Under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, there is the Drugs Rules of 1945. Apart from the Drugs Rules of 1945, the central government has also introduced the new Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019. Apart from the Act and the two different rules, there is also the 2017 edition of the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants. Apart from this, there is also the guideline for good clinical practice in clinical research, which is published by the office of CDSCO. Let us start with the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940 and the Drugs Rules of 1945. So, in India, the principal law that regulates drug trials is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940. Drugs and Cosmetics Act we have covered in some previous lectures as well. Under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, there is the Drug Rules 1945, which ensures that consumers have access to high quality cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. The Drugs and Cosmetics Act, along with the rules, ensure that stringent regulatory standard is followed for cosmetic products and pharmaceutical products which are made available to consumers in India. The rules governing clinical trials in India have undergone numerous amendments to ensure effective regulation. The provisions for conducting clinical trials in India are prescribed in Rules 122DA, 122DAA, 122DAB, 122DAC, 122DD, 122E, and also Schedule Y of the drug rules of 1945. The drug rules provide that no clinical trial for a new drug, whether for clinical investigation or for clinical experiment, shall be conducted without the written permission from the licensing authority. The licensing authority under the drug rules is the Drug Controller General of India. So, clinical trials in India cannot be conducted without the written permission from the Drug Controller General of India. The detailed experiments and guidelines for undertaking clinical trials are provided in Schedule Y of the said rules. So, Schedule Y in detail provides the requirements and guidelines for undertaking clinical trials. Schedule 5 requires clinical trial to be conducted, data generated, documented and reported in compliance with the protocol and good clinical practice guidelines specified under the statute. So, the statute prescribes the protocol and good clinical practice. Schedule Y requires compliance with that practice. Clinical trials are conducted in compliance with the provisions of the drug rules and care is taken to protect the rights, safety and well-being of the subjects. Schedule Y of the drug rules specify that there shall be an ethics committee and it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to review and accord approval to the trial protocol to safeguard the rights, safety and well-being of the trial subjects. However, there were several concerns regarding the safety and compensation provided to patients in cases of adverse effects suffered due to participation in clinical trials. So, in India, there were several instances reported wherein subjects were induced to clinical trial by offering monetary payments, and clinical trial has resulted in many adverse health impact on such subjects. This was brought to the attention of Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Swasthya Adhikar Manch versus Union of India in 2012. In 2012, an NGO, Swasthya Adhikar Manch, filed a public interest litigation before the Honorable Supreme Court alleging misconduct in the execution of clinical trials. The Supreme Court considered the issue in an elaborate manner and emphasized that approvals for clinical trials should be based on a thorough assessment of safety and efficacy, giving due attention to the evaluation of risk versus benefit of patients, level of innovation compared to existing therapeutic options and the unmet medical needs of the country. So, in this judgment, the Supreme Court emphasized that clinical trials should be allowed only through assessment of safety and efficacy. The possible impact on the patients and the subjects of clinical trial should also be evaluated before granting the approval. In 2013, thus some amendments were made into the drugs and cosmetic rules to give effect to the principles enshrined in the Supreme Court decision. These rules, which is Rule 122DAB, provided for compensation to an affected clinical trial subject in case injury or death happens during the clinical trial. So, the newly introduced provision ensures that compensation will be paid to the clinical trial subject in case of injury or death. Rule 122DAC made it mandatory to obtain the approval of ethics committee and registration of trial with the Clinical Trials Registry of India, and also the submission of reports of various adverse events. So, after this amendment, it was made mandatory that clinical trials can be conducted only after obtaining approval from the ethics committee and registration in the Clinical Trials Registry of India was also made mandatory. In case of any adverse event, the company who is conducting the clinical trial has a responsibility to immediately report the incident to the appropriate authority. In 2018, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare published the new draft of the drugs and clinical trial rules. The rules were framed under Section 12 subsection 1 and also Section 33 subsection 1 of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. But however, it took a long time for the ministry to finalize the rules after an elaborate consultation process. Finally, the rules were notified in 2019. These rules are known as the new Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019. So, the new Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019 is at present the regulatory framework that governs clinical trials in India. Now, let us have a look at the salient features of the 2019 rules. Rule 2W defines new drug. New drug includes a drug including an active pharmaceutical ingredient or phytopharmaceutical drug which has not been used in the country to any significant extent. The new rules are applicable to regulate all new drugs, investigational new drugs for human use, clinical trials, bioequivalence studies, bioavailability studies and ethics committees. Apart from new drug, adverse event is also defined under the new rules. Rules 2D provide that any untoward incident of medical occurrence during treatment with an investigational drug or a pharmaceutical product or a trial subject is considered as an adverse event. In case of adverse event, compensation is payable to the trial subject. The Drug Controller of India is appointed by the central government, is designated as the central licensing authority under the rules, and the Drug Controller of India acts as a nodal entity for licensing and granting approval for clinical trials. The rules mandate establishing and registering an ethics committee by the entities who are planning to conduct clinical trials, bioavailability studies or bioequivalence studies. The study or trial can commence only upon obtaining approval from registered ethics committees. The registration of ethics committee with the central licensing authority remains valid for a period of 5 years. In the event a serious adverse occurrence has happened during a clinical trial, bioavailability study or bioequivalence study, the ethics committee should examine the documents related to the incident. Chapter 6 of the rules focus on addressing compensation matters arising from injuries or fatalities during the clinical trials. The quantum of compensation is to be determined in accordance with the formula outlined in the 7th schedule of the rules. So, the compensation is to be provided to the victims of clinical trial in accordance with the 2019 rules. Permission of the central licensing authority must be obtained for manufacture of a new drug for conducting the clinical trial. The permission is initially valid for a period of 3 years. The license from the central licensing authority must be obtained to import a new drug for conducting the clinical trial. The license, once it is granted, is valid for a period of 3 years. These rules do not apply to academic clinical trial, biological research or for medical studies. To conclude, India is considered as a pharmacy of the developing world. The law and policy initiatives of the government allowed the Indian pharmaceutical industry to thrive for a long period. But there exists a possibility that the vulnerable condition of Indian population would be exploited by domestic and foreign pharma industries. This necessitates the formulation of stringent laws to curb illegal and unethical practices. The recent changes in the legal framework have resulted in the creation of a robust and effective regulatory regime. The references of this lecture can be seen here. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture. I hope you are enjoying the course.